All right. So, like I was saying, so 179 registered members, which is great. Websites here, and Twitter is there. Busy admitting people as we go along. And so, again, DISCOURSE is an international consortium dedicated to the study of language speech in psychosis. We have members from all over the world, Turkey, Australia, the US, Netherlands, Canada, Brazil, and Spain. If you have any questions about DISCOURSE or want to get in touch, just feel free to contact any of the members of the steering committee. And again, we are in the third session of the seminar series for 2022. So 2 talks already done, and like I said, they will be on the YouTube channel for you to view. And we have a few more coming up in the next couple of months. So generally the last Friday of every month. And so, like I said, today we will be having a speaker and discussant that I'll introduce in the next slides. And talks will go on for about an hour and a bit, after which we'll have a bit of open discussion where everyone's welcome to put their questions in the chat box or to speak online. And then we'll go into Q&A until the end of the 2 hours that we have allocated for the session. So our speaker for today is Dr. Lena Palaniyappan, who is a practicing psychiatrist and researcher at the Douglas Research Center, McGill University in Montreal. He holds the Monique H. Bourgeois Chair in Developmental Disorders and is the inaugural director, Center for Youth Mental Health Service Innovation, Research and Training at the Douglas Institute. He's also associated with the Robarts Research Institute, Western University in London, Ontario. And our discussant for today is Dr. Philipp Homan. He's the Vice Chair at the University Hospital of Psychiatry in Zurich. And he's interested in ways of understanding and quantifying different aspects of heterogeneity in psychotic disorders, including language and its deviations. And so without further ado, I shall throw it over to Lena to start sharing his screen and begin his talk.
Thank you very much, Eric. Let me share my screen first. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
I decided not to share my woes of applying for grants this morning. I wanted to just stick to the slides. Good morning and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to give a talk on the topic that we've been discussing for a long time now, the characteristic basis, neural basis of formal thought disorder. We had an excellent talk in this seminar series by Thilo Kircher last year. I'm going to continue from some of the discussions that was raised by Thilo last year. And I'm going to also show some of the new data that we have that takes us beyond language network when it comes to understanding the neural correlates of thought disorder. And a lot of you might recognize this background animation picture here. This is Hagood's summary of the language network using imaging modalities, various imaging modalities. So this is our group, Neuroimaging and Mental Illness Group at the Robarts Research Center in London, Ontario. So a lot of work that I'm going to show today was done by energetic members of this group, primarily Roberto Limungi. He's a postdoc working with our group. He's a senior researcher, Bayesian expertise. And Maria is a speech and language therapist, Maria Alonso Sanchez, and she's working on some specific aspects of semantic analysis with language data. Also, Angelica Silva, she's a linguist as well as an educational psychologist by training, and she's primarily working on understanding syntactic complexity and syntax-related changes in schizophrenia. And a lot of other members here have been working on collecting data, speech data and language data from patients with psychosis, and many others are doing imaging analysis as well in this group. So one of the ideas that is now well-rooted and well-known to many of us working in psychosis is it is a disorder of disconnectivity at various spatial scales. And if you look at the synaptic scale, the micro scale of disconnection, one neuron doesn't communicate well with the other neuron. And this could be because of neurotransmitter problems or receptor level problems or synaptic biology issues. And there's a lot of genetic evidence supporting a background disturbance in synaptic biology in schizophrenia. Now, that kind of micro-scale disconnection could translate also to mesoscale level, by which we mean brain network level interactions being disintegrated or aberrant in schizophrenia. And this can be recovered from functional imaging studies as well as structural studies looking at connectivity primarily. These levels of disconnect is also seen when you sit with a patient in a clinic. You see that they express ideas that are not connected with each other. And sometimes their ideas are not connected with the behavior that they display. And sometimes the words that they produce in a sentence may not be connected well with each other. So all of this manifest level disconnect is also very notable in schizophrenia. And language analysis puts a lot of emphasis on uncovering this disconnectivity. And then we also see at the social level, at a larger community level, interpersonal relations, connectivity that people have with each other is also disrupted in psychosis. And in fact, most of the social disability, functional disability in psychosis comes from the social scale disconnectivity that happens as a result of this illness. So is there a thread that joins all these levels of disconnectivity? I think that's a very challenging question with no clear answers so far that anyone can convincingly provide. Today, I'm going to focus on the connect between the mesoscale and manifest scale disconnectivity. If we measure brain networks using imaging procedures, which is the mesoscale level of disconnect, could be related to manifest scale disconnectivity that you measure in a clinical setting, and primarily measuring the concept of thought disorder, formal thought disorder. So what do we know so far about this level of connection, the connection between brain networks and formal thought disorder in schizophrenia? And this was nicely summarized by Thilo last year in the talk that he gave with the amazing amount of mass of work done over the years, both in functional imaging and structural imaging. What I have here is 3 recent meta-analyses in the last 4 years, actually 4 of them, all of them arguing for a case that language network disconnectivity is a feature of formal thought disorder in schizophrenia. So what you see here is the first picture is a Wensing's meta-analysis, primarily functional MRI studies, 17 functional MRI studies, and also a couple of PET studies included in this. And the question they asked was, if you differentiate people with thought disorder, formal thought disorder, and contrast them from people without formal thought disorder or healthy controls, when they're performing certain tasks, fMRI, certain tasks in the functional scanner, mostly language tasks, what are the regions that are showing aberrant activation, either increased or reduced activation? And their meta-analytical synthesis pointed towards 2 consistent regions, both of them in the temporal cortex on the left side, STG and superior temporal and middle temporal regions. So for follow-up study from Wensing's work by the same group, Chen and others, published last year, extended this further, producing functional connectivity maps from these 2 spots and seeing how this functional connectivity operates in patients with thought disorder. And they showed that these 2 regions have a very widespread disconnectivity in people with thought disorder. This is functional task fMRI. And then we have a very nice extensive summary of multiple modalities of imaging by Cavalti and colleagues. Of course, Philipp, you were involved in this meta-analysis, Philipp Homan's group, and Thilo Kircher as well. So this is a very overarching summary of different abnormalities shown in people with formal thought disturbances with different modalities. And summary is the picture that you see here is the summary, and you can see the evidence, as argued by Cavalti and colleagues, pointed towards a left lateralized language network dysfunction in relation to formal thought disorder. And that included areas in superior and middle temporal gyrus, inferior parietal lobule, as well as Broca's area and inferior frontal gyrus. Then Philipp Sumner came up with 2 extensive reviews around the same time. Philipp Sumner working with Susan Rosell. Very impressive summary of multiple imaging modalities, but differently summarized structural studies differentiated from functional studies. And Philipp Sumner's work really pointed towards evidence extending beyond language network when it comes to formal thought disorder. Of course, there were abnormalities that were found in the other two meta-analyses as well in the language network regions. But Philipp Sumner's work also pointed towards a non-language, conventionally not regarded as language areas, also implicated in formal thought disorder. These reviews, other than giving a synthesis, what are the common areas affected in these different studies, in addition to that, they also pointed out the issues we have in conducting neuroimaging studies and trying to understand the neural correlates of constructs such as formal thought disorder. And one of the issue is the conflating problem between what is the diagnostic effect and what is the effect of symptom severity. Patients with schizophrenia without any thought disorder could also show language network problems, number one. Number two, people who have high degree of formal thought disorder can also have other symptoms in a very severe range, like auditory hallucinations, for example. We do not know how these symptom correlations play out at the neural basis yet. And we also do not know how much is the diagnostic effect we see in some of these studies and how much is the effect of symptom burden itself. And third thing we do not know is many of these studies are done in an established schizophrenia population who have been exposed for medication for a long time, with chronicity also being a factor in affecting structure and function, especially important for gray matter volume studies and also DTI studies, because it's quite well established now that longer someone has schizophrenia, the more structural changes that you can see in the brain. So with all those caveats, I'm going to show you a few recent studies, individual studies that points us towards some answers for those problems raised by this meta-analysis. So this is an unpublished umbrella review. This is Xiao Cheng working in Fudan University. Xiao and colleagues nicely summarized the overlap between structural and functional changes in studies of auditory verbal hallucination and studies of formal thought disorder. So what you see as a table here is all of the different meta-analysis summarizing different modalities of imaging in formal thought disorder on the top and on auditory verbal hallucinations on the bottom. There are a lot of meta-analysis, by the way. So what you see here as a graphical representation is on top is the regions of interest that have shown up in the association between formal thought disorder and structure of the brain and the functional abnormalities in the brain. And at the bottom, you see the same relationship played out for auditory verbal hallucinations. You can see the overlap is not trivial. You can see the left lateralized superior temporal regions implicated in both. You can see that the inferior frontal gyrus is implicated in both of these conditions. So the question that whether some of the FTD studies that we saw earlier in the meta-analysis, are they confounded by a severe degree of other symptoms, such as auditory verbal hallucinations? That question is an important one. And future studies have to really parse this out, because this overlap seems to be substantial and not trivial. For the question of whether diagnosis itself influences language network, there are a couple of observations which suggest that's probably true. We will have effect of presence of schizophrenia on language network abnormalities, even though thought disorder may not be very severe in patients. So this is one such example. This is Avyarthana Day. She did a master's with our group a few years ago. And what she did was she took the resting state fMRI scans from a number of untreated schizophrenia patients, first episode patients, who we typically recruit within the first week of presentation to the services. So on average, they had less than 1 to 1.5 doses of antipsychotics exposed by the time we scanned them. And they were also acutely disorganized, acutely symptomatic. And the question that she asked was based on overall connectivity in the brain. So she used an approach called centrality. Centrality is an intuitive index to understand. If you think about social network, we all have our Facebook networks, Instagram networks. So many of us have a number of connections with our social network. You can play a map of a social network connectivity like this, and you can see among your friends who is the most connected person. So here in this particular map, you see Alice has a number of connections, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So you can say Alice is the hub here. She's the highly central connection in your entire social network. Same way in the brain, you can calculate for each voxel how many other voxels each voxel is connected to. And that connectivity index, the higher it is, the higher the degree is, and that tells you how much central the particular voxel is. If you then compare two groups, patients with schizophrenia and healthy people, and subtract the contrast and find out what are the areas in the brain where the centrality is affected in the presence of schizophrenia, you actually see, before even you consider thought disorder, presence of thought disorder or not, you see the right superior temporal gyrus and insula cluster showing a significant reduction in centrality. And this cluster is well connected bilaterally to the areas that we're discussing, insula, superior temporal gyrus, on both sides as well. So centrality reduction, which is overlapping on STG, is present even before you consider the severity of thought disorder. It is not simply a phenomena of severe thought disturbance. It's present in schizophrenia, even before medication exposure happens. And a very similar finding from a completely different data set collected in China, in Shanghai. This is Jinian Du. He's a researcher in, he was a PhD student at the time of his work with Jiang Feng in Fudan University. So Jinian did a very interesting separation of the untreated psychosis patients. He separated them into two groups, one with low chronicity, very short duration of illness, and the other with long duration of illness, both groups being untreated. So this group is untreated for a longer period of time. And he then did pairwise connectivity analysis across the entire brain to understand, to ask the question, what pairs of brain regions are most disconnected in the presence of first episode schizophrenia before antipsychotics are started. Sorry, I just saw a question. I'll come back to this in a minute. What Jinian showed was in both short duration and long duration groups, the disconnectivity involving Broca's area was prominent. You can see here, this is very small figure, so let me enlarge it for you. So what you see here is in the short duration group as well, the most disconnected region involves bilateral, both right and left, inferior frontal gyrus, triangularis section, which is very close to the functional Broca's area. And what you don't see here is actually STG is also involved, but in the long duration group. So the presence of language network disconnectivity happens quite early, and it seems to be present irrespective of the disorganization burden and thought disorder burden in these samples. So the other issue is whether if we consider language network dysfunction as a problem related to presence of schizophrenia and not just presence of thought disorder severity, what happens when you seek neural correlates of thought disorder in other diagnoses like depression, bipolar disorder, for example? Do you really come back to the language network as the focus of interest? This question is very challenging to answer because we don't have a lot of trans-diagnostic samples investigating formal thought disorder and its neural correlates yet. But the most impressive samples have been collected in Germany by Thilo Kircher and group. It's the FOR 2107 cohort, 1,071 broad spectrum of patients between age 18 and 65 with depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia. Most patients are seeking outpatient help in a hospital setting. Some of them are inpatients as well, I guess. But these are patients with established illness and treated for a while. And this is two nice papers published by Frederick Stein in Thilo Kircher's group. What Frederick did was she extracted a single factor for formal thought disorder, a positive formal thought disorder factor. And she established first that this factor was present in all different disorders, depressive disorder, bipolar disorder, as well as schizophrenia. And she sought the gray matter volume changes related to this factor. And she showed that one of the only association that she could find in this trans-diagnostic sample was a small area in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, middle frontal gyrus on the right. So this is not the conventional language area that you would expect in such a trans-diagnostic large sample. Then she also looked at a more specific question of looking only at the formal thought disorder dimensions, not including any other symptoms, but in the same trans-diagnostic sample. And she looked at DTI changes, FA changes as well in this analysis. And again, the relationships that she could find for factors such as disorganization and emptiness, similar to positive and negative formal thought disorder dimensions, were not in the traditional language network regions. These are in the extended language network regions, but not something that you would expect intuitively from the previous works on language network. This is another evidence to suggest that the picture is not as clear as we would have expected from the meta-analysis. This is a work that I undertook along with Peter Liddell in Nottingham a few years ago. It's a small sample of around 20 patients and 20 healthy people. This is probably the first 7 Tesla study in schizophrenia, looking at multiple modalities of imaging. So what we did here was we separated the positive and negative formal thought disorder dimensions using the TLI scale. And we were asking the question, what is the whole brain level changes? We were not looking at any specific ROIs, regions of interest in language area, but we did a whole brain search using a multivariate morphometry. And what we found was the negative formal thought disorder burden, impoverishment, related to multiple different brain changes, multiple covarying structural networks. And interestingly, it was not always loss or reduction of gray matter volume that related to severity of formal thought disorder. There were also regions that showed increase or excess of gray matter volume in patients that related to severity of thought disorder. So there are some either adaptive or compensatory changes that may also explain this kind of relationship that we see in formal thought disorder studies. And what you see on this side, right, is the same sample, but here we parcellated the brain into different functional networks based on a atlas, functional atlas, EO atlas, 17 different networks, and we measured thickness, but we measured coherence of thickness across these regions. So for example, take one network, the salience network, for example. It will be distributed in 3 different regions, the insula, the ACC, as well as some of the anterior frontal regions. So if you then assume that there is a single swath of tissue called salience network, and then you calculate the point-by-point thickness for each vertex across this network, you can see patterns like this. There will be thickness values in one area, maybe low, the other area may be high. So you can calculate the coefficient of variation across this entire salience network morphometry thickness values. So subject A shows some regions with very low thickness and some regions with very high thickness. So this person will have high level of spatial incoherence within the network. But subject D will have very little variation across the entire network. So if you ask the question, does this incoherence relate to formal thought disorder? Because if you think the functional networks are not deployed coherently during task processing, then the plastic changes in thickness should reflect that lack of coherent deployment of functional networks. What we found was the thickness values of frontoparietal network and the incoherence of salience network related to the burden of thought disorder. And language network changes only relates to the fact whether thought disorder was present in a detectable way or not. It did not map on with the severity. So perhaps thought disorder needs some level of language network dysfunction, but how severe the thought disorder is may depend on how other networks are playing out in terms of structure and function. So this is, again, a small sample, but gives you an idea that other networks may be also playing an important role in formal thought disorder. This is Wei Wei. He's a student in Changsha. He's now doing a postdoctoral work. He collected a large amount of intracortical myelin data, T1 by T2 ratio data, which stands for myelin. It's a proxy for myelin within the gray matter. And this is from drug-naive schizophrenia patients, around 100 patients and 100 healthy people. And this is a couple of a series of 2 studies he published in Human Brain Mapping and Cerebral Cortex recently. It's very interesting phenomena he observed. When you just look at what are the areas of brain where intracortical myelin varies in patients with schizophrenia, you see several broad networks, structural covariance networks with myelin differences. And he found that the perisylvian, the language network region, the perisylvian region had higher myelin, intracortical myelin in first episode schizophrenia. Higher myelin may reflect lower thickness values as well. So he found higher myelin, but interestingly, the higher myelin was present in people who had lower severity of disorganization. So it is possible that higher disorganization is an uncompensated state, but lower levels of disorganization has a compensation working in patients who have schizophrenia. Again, we do not really discuss compensatory mechanisms very well in studies of neuroimaging studies of FTD, because most of them are cross-sectional, and it's very difficult to tease apart what is compensatory, what is adaptive in cross-sectional designs. So where are we now with all these new emerging findings? How do they map with the meta-analytical synthesis implicating language network? I think we cannot dismiss the fact that other symptoms of schizophrenia also map onto the language network, and auditory verbal hallucinations as an example. Language network disconnectivity doesn't look like it is attributable to treatment from the drug-naive studies that I showed implicating both Broca's and STG disconnectivity early on. But there may be some compensatory changes within the language network that may reduce our ability to observe relationship with formal thought disorder. The formal thought disorder language network relationship is more likely to be present if there is a diagnosis of schizophrenia. You don't see the same pattern in trans-diagnostic samples, and schizophrenia itself affects language network structure and function. So this may be a diagnostic effect as well. And several language networks are also implicated. Several other networks are also implicated, not just language network when it comes to formal thought disorder. So with that summary, I just wanted to look at the chat question that Iris has put in. Let me see if I can go to the chat. So the question is regarding the DAY study, regarding cortical hubs. The 70 is at an advantage as voxels may need strong multiple comparison correction. Yeah, that's a good question, Iris. It's a very convenient imaging analysis use we did because we were collecting data on a functional MRS using 7 Tesla, and we also had resting fMRI in the same sample. So our first analysis was relating the resting fMRI data in 7T to the disorganization scores in that sample. I do not think there's any special advantage of using 7 Tesla for measuring things like centrality, unless you want to do some layer-to-layer connectivity, which is a different problem. I don't want to get into it today, but there's no specific advantage at all. I think we can recover the same centrality patterns using 3 Tesla studies. In fact, Peter Little and myself did some studies early on, nearly 10 years ago now, looking at diagnostic discontinuity between bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, and using centrality from 3 Tesla scanner as a measure, which was very similar results as well. Insular centrality and language network area centralities was reduced in schizophrenia. Okay, so let's move on to the other systems that I've been talking about, other than language. So one of the systems that we have been really interested in is the triple network system, which is a comprehensive framework of language network, large-scale network interaction, initially put forward by Vinod Menon and colleagues, based on a very interesting work done by Bill Seeley and others at Stanford. So what is triple network? Triple network is primarily a physiological framework of interaction among 3 large-scale information processing systems. One is the salience network, which is a connection between anterior insula and ACC, dorsal ACC as the main regions, but also includes subcortical nodes as well as thalamus. And then the other information processing networks are default mode network and executive control network, CEN, which is the frontoparietal network. I think we have, many of us doing imaging work over years have come across these networks many times, but just for others, a very basic reductive rubric to understand the function of these networks is sometimes when we are processing information, we are processing internal information, we're just thinking about our own autobiographical information, our own self, or ruminating on what is internal to us. And at that time, our activity patterns seem to be higher in default mode regions. And when we are explicitly processing information using objects or stimuli outside of us, we tend to use the frontoparietal network, the central executive network, the task positive networks. The switch between these two, the seamless switch that we often do between internal and external world, seems to be facilitated at a physiological level by the salience network, primarily the anterior insula being the driver of the switch. And there is a lot of evidence from multiple different types of modality, including intracortical recordings now, and optogenetics now, suggesting anterior insula performs this kind of switching activity between 2 large-scale networks. So we've been interested in this for a while, and there are some studies now I'm going to show suggesting this network may play an important role in the severity of conceptual disorganization and thought disorder. So this is a work that we did with Vinod Menon and Supekar at Stanford, based on publicly available data sets with resting fMRI data sets in patients with schizophrenia. So the primary question here is using functional MRI, but asking dynamic connectivity, extracting dynamic functional connectivity, which is a time varying property. So for each small time window, you measure the connectivity among different networks. Here we're interested in 3 networks. And you see what patterns can you recover in the levels of connectivity among these 3 networks over a longer period of time. So this is dynamic functional connectivity. And what you see here, if you just put these three networks in this analysis and see how many patterns of different patterns of connectivity emerge in a 10-minute frame of rest in healthy people and also in schizophrenia patients. In healthy control, there's only two patterns of connectivity between these three networks, the S1 and S2 state across the 10 minutes. In schizophrenia patients, the variance is very high. There is many more states that we can recover using the dynamic functional connectivity approach in schizophrenia. And this was replicated in two different data sets in this particular study. And then if you look at the relationship between various different symptoms and the level of instability. So these patterns are centered on insula. As I mentioned before, insula is the center for the switching between the two networks. So if you calculate an index of the insula centeredness, it's called NII, Network Interaction Index, how unstable the interaction that is anchored on insula. If you calculate the index and relate it to symptom severity, this is a canonical correlation, by the way. So what you see is a very strong relationship. Please remember this is canonical, so the R values are high. But you can see the pattern of relationship between the instability centered on the triple network system and symptoms such as CD is conceptual disorganization. That's the most loading symptom here. And also hallucinatory behavior loads on this. These two go together often, and this is a problem that we cannot easily solve using observational studies. But you can see conceptual disorganization also is a very important, one of the important players for conceptual disorganization is the triple network instability. Now, we had a very similar observation using a completely different data set and a different approach. This time we asked the question of same three networks, but we asked the question, can we predict the presence of schizophrenia and differentiate it from bipolar disorder using a machine learning framework if you use the three networks and their interactions as the basis. And this is a study in collaboration with Gopi Deshpande, an engineer at Auburn. Myself and Peter Liddell were involved in this. So we had established cases of schizophrenia, 38 patients and around 19 people with bipolar disorder. Now, all of them had psychosis. So when they initially presented, the illness were indistinguishable, but over time, the patterns emerged into two different diagnostic patterns. And we studied them when the illness was established and diagnosis was possible, separation was possible. So what we saw was the variance, which is the instability of dynamic connectivity. This time it is Granger causal effective connectivity. The variance was highly predictive of presence of schizophrenia. And another thing that really separated patients from patients with schizophrenia from bipolar disorder was actually the degree of disorganization. So if you put symptoms, connectivity, and structure together, you can separate these two illnesses with a very high degree of accuracy. We did a nested cross-validation. Remember, this is a small sample, so the accuracies may be very inflated, but we saw around 90% accuracy for balanced accuracy estimations to separate these two. And the factors that contributed to it was disorganization burden and also the instability centered on insula bilaterally in the system. So where does it take us, this information that connects triple network with disorganization that we see in schizophrenia? I think many of us are working on imaging aspects of language, are quite familiar with the Hagood's model of language processing, which argues there are three systems primarily. One is the memory system, the other is the unification system, and then there is a control system for memory, for language processing. Memory being the representation of stored conceptual information, and it's primarily the semantic system anchored on temporal cortex. And then the unification system, which probably does the role of Chomsky's merge function, so to speak. It brings representations together. And according to Hagood, this could reside in Broca's area, left inferior frontal gyrus. And then Hagood's initial model also talked about a control system, the executive system, which affects how we plan our discourse. And initially, the discussion in Hagood's model involved prefrontal cortex in general. But I think we can accommodate this idea that a cognitive control network, like the triple network system anchored on salience network, could be really the control system for language and the discourse planning aspects from some of the observations that we make in schizophrenia. These ideas have been summarized in a review. It was just published last year if you're interested in reading further on this. So this is probably my last data slide, 2 slides to just show some more data before we wrap this up and go to discussion. We often study conceptual disorganization using rating scales, but what is conceptual disorganization? It's not something that all of us can see. It's a construct of formal thought disorder. It's not easy to see. One approach for this is modeling conceptual disorganization as a latent construct, a construct that we cannot see, but we can recover computationally using other variables that we can actually observe and measure objectively. So this is a work done by Roberto Limongi in our group. He's been working on this for the last couple of years. A very interesting approach using, for instance, free energy principles and bringing active inference into modeling the idea of conceptual disorganization. So if for a moment we assume we put aside the argument that language is a tool for communication. We often say language is a tool for communication. But for a moment, if we put that aside and say language and speech is a tool to understand the other person's intentions, the tool to reduce our uncertainty about our world, the world around us, the uncertainty that we have about the world, we reduce it by deploying speech, by deploying language. We ask questions, we understand each other by using language. So if we use that model as an active inference model of language for a moment, then you can build a very nice computational model of conceptual disorganization. So you start with saying language is employed primarily to reduce the uncertainty, and this uncertainty is the conceptual disorganization, or the certainty is the conceptual organization we have about representations around us. So a very coherent speech is a reflection of the conceptual organization, and if the speech is incoherent, you could say there is a high degree of conceptual disorganization. So what Roberto has done here is he's modeled this. So what you see here is 2 scenarios, a scenario with high conceptual organization. Let's say this is the healthy control state, and there is a scenario B, a patient state where there is low prior conceptual organization. So what you have here is the probability of observing incoherent speech. For example, the probability of being uncertain about the world that you have around you. So that can be given numerically, x1 and x2, the certainty. And here, when you have a low prior conceptual organization, you're not sure, you're not certain. So you have the priors being equal on both sides. So here the priors are weighted on one side, here they're equal on both sides. Now you see an object, the person is given a picture, a flower pot. Actually, there is a flower pot with flowers inside it, the plant is inside it. And the person may decide to employ language in 2 different ways. They may say, when they describe this flower pot, they may say, this is a flower pot with flowers inside, which is quite easy for everybody to grasp what is being represented. But they can also say, it's a flower pot, there are some flowers there. And you often see this kind of speech when you elicit a descriptive speech in patients with schizophrenia. There's a flower pot, there's some flowers there, for example. So there are 2 levels of organization here, 2 levels of analytic thinking. You can actually measure how coherent these 2 are using how people order their concept words and function words. And there is an index called analytical thinking index that gives you a simple numerical value of how coherent the information is packaged. So what you see here in the top example, you will have a high value, and in the bottom example, you will have a low value of analytical thinking index. So now you have a measure of likelihood based on this speech that you recorded. You can estimate the posteriors of this prior by using this observed data, but you need to use the framework of, for instance, variational free energy in order to recover these posteriors. So this is exactly what Roberto has done. This paper is in press, but well, not in press, it's under review. I'm jumping the gun here, but this is available as a preprint if you're interested to read this. So basically, conceptual disorganization is a hidden construct that can be estimated if you have a measure of analytical thinking index, and if you assume language is used as a tool to reduce uncertainty in the world around us. So then what Roberto did, he actually took the resting fMRI connectivity values in a dynamic causal model framework, DCM framework. So this is insula and anterior cingulate cortex, the same salience network system that I was talking about. So you measure you recover the connectivity parameters using a resting state DCM model for this network, that's RSDCM. You have analytical thinking index scores. You also have clinical measures of thought disorder from the sample using TLI scale, and also the P2, which is a conceptual disorganization rating from PANS. You also have the information whether somebody in front of you is a patient or a healthy person. So the group information is here. Then you build a model how much the hidden latent construct of conceptual organization or conceptual disorganization reflects all of these variables that we can measure and recover objectively. So what Roberto did was he used probabilistic causal models, graphical causal models, and as soon as you put conceptual organization, the computed parameters of conceptual organization in a model like this, that model explains the disconnectivity within the salience network in the dynamic causal model framework. And you don't really need to depend on the group information, the P2, or the global disorganization in thinking or global impoverishment of thinking scores. In other words, the clinical rating scales as well as the group information is trumped by this computed construct of conceptual disorganization when it comes to explaining a brain level dysfunction that we see in schizophrenia. And if you parse it further, which aspect of this DCM, this dynamic causal connectivity model, is affected in people with high disorganization, people with high scores of conceptual disorganization, the computed scores, generally have higher inhibitory tone within ACC, the dorsal ACC. In other words, they have low synaptic gain, but they have higher insular to ACC excitatory drive. Again, there's lots of concepts I've thrown at you, synaptic gain and inhibitory systems. More details are available in the preprint if you're interested, and we can also discuss this further as we move along. If there are any specific questions on this. But the point I want to make is conceptual organization can be modeled computationally if you have objective measures of language from recorded speech transcripts, for example, and that model, the computational psychopathology measurement, reflects brain variables much better than FTD scores or any of the scores that we have. And this is Roberto's picture, flashing again to show the good work he has done. Right, so parsing the network level mechanisms of FTD is not a done deal. We have to look further than the conventional language network hypothesis, in my opinion. We cannot ignore the other aspects of emerging evidence. Even when we try to map a language network specifically with the prior interest onto the concept of FTD, there are still many challenges, even before we look further than FTD. Number one, the confounded diagnostic effect. We discussed that earlier. Schizophrenia itself could affect these networks. The symptom overlap issue is not trivial, and there's no good answer for that in observational studies. Simply controlling for severity of one symptom does not provide an optimal solution, because when you control for severity of one symptom, you artificially induce a psychopathological state that you do not see in clinical practice. And we also have a big challenge in studying FTD's neural correlates. Unlike people who are interested in auditory verbal hallucinations, for example, there's no way we can induce FTD reliably. There's no controlled FTD induction experiments we can do. So there is a big challenge of symptom capture in the scanner for formal thought disorder. And what I have here is some examples from discussions that myself, Philipp, and Maria Alonso Sanchez is having to set up a review of these problems. And what I have here is some of the options we can consider to overcome these challenges. The symptom capture is a challenge. We cannot induce symptoms, but we can think of doing our experiments in a social setting where two people interact with each other and we do recordings of their neural activities, because social discourse for unknown reasons, social discourse increases the chances of these disorganized thinking patterns emerging in our patients. So two-person studies and hyperscanning studies may be a useful paradigm to use, and also considering longitudinal designs where patients are observed in acute disorganization state as well as in chronic persistent FTD state would be helpful for us to parse what is acute and what is chronic correlates. And also having in-scanner speech recordings. Easy to say, difficult to do, given the head movement that happens in the scanner. But if we can overcome some of those hurdles, we can then actually use objective readouts from the speech samples to measure things like coherence, to measure computational linguistic parameters from the speech samples in the scanner, and relate them to the neural correlates that we are interested in. And the next thing is the issue of grading severity, not a trivial issue. Again, using NLP metrics, computational metrics, in addition to rating scales, may help us to move in this direction, to be more objective in how we measure the construct of thought disorder. And another point I want to mention is, so far, most of our causal mapping studies have been clearly observational. And even if they're experimental, the experiment is changing the behavior to see what happens to brain activity, not the other way around. We really need to change the brain activity to see what happens to the behavior. And to do those kind of framework, those kind of studies, we really need to perturb the brain function, and TMS and other stimulation approaches used in this context may help us really to study what happens when language network is perturbed, what happens to thought disorder, what happened to some of these objectively recoverable parameters of language that we can record from human speech now. And this is the idea of second-person neuroscience. If you have two people together, both of them thinking, both of them asking questions, and both of them having their activities recorded, brain activities recorded, we may be able to get closer to the neural correlates of formal thought disorder. And I guess social neuroscience of psychosis really starts with the study of how we use language before, during, and after experiencing psychosis. This is an idea that's summarized in a short editorial written by Venkat and myself in the JPN, Journal of Psychiatry and Neuroscience, if you're interested. So beyond FTD for severity framework, as a point I've mentioned, detecting deviations in speech and language using rating scales is not sufficient. We may have to consider speech disturbance as a variation of normal language use. When we do that, immediately we increase the base rate of detecting the construct that we want to relate with the neural substrate. Because presence of FTD itself using rating scales is a lower, prevalence is lower compared to measuring this as a continuum using the variation model, the linguistic primacy model. So we've done some studies in that context, and this is Angelica Silva. What she has shown is taking syntactic complexity as a measurement from recorded speech variables. And if you see what happens to this kind of language meshes, computational meshes, they're not static, they change over time. So this is also a problem we have to really overcome when we try to seek neural correlates. So syntactic complexity changes over time in healthy people as well as in patients with schizophrenia and other psychosis. But in healthy people, the variations because of re-exposure to the same stimulus, same picture. If you show the same picture twice, the second time people describe it in a more rich, with using more rich, complex ideas compared to the first time because they're used to this picture. But in patients with schizophrenia, that doesn't happen. What we've shown here in a small sample, observed longitudinally over 6 months, is the syntactic complexity actually drops in schizophrenia, and the drop, if there is a 30% decrease in syntactic complexity after 6 months, that increases the probability of diagnosing schizophrenia in a group of first episode patients by nearly 95%. There's also work done by Angelica Silva and Roberto Limongi using probabilistic graph models. So this is also telling you that if we use computational linguistic measures, the relationship with the language network may be stronger than using formal thought disorder as a construct. This is Maria Alonso Sanchez, another postdoc working in our group, originally from Chile, from Valparaiso University. So she looked at dynamic causal model relating semantic hub and Broca's area from resting state and related that to the incoherence that you can measure using vector-based models of semantic similarity. So if you measure semantic similarity in a frame of 1 minute speech between different words, you can relate that to how relationship between Broca's area and semantic hub exists in healthy people and patients with schizophrenia. I'm not going into details of the study. I'm just showing this as a highlights of the options, the possibilities we have if we use computational measures of linguistics and study the language network in psychosis. Where does this all lead to? Why do we have to really establish the neural correlates of formal thought disorder? As many of us here in this group, we appreciate there's no specific treatment for persistent FTD, even though persistent formal thought disorder seems to be at the core of what we all understand as schizophrenia. This is a pictorial representation of many TMS studies, the target areas in the brain used for TMS in schizophrenia. Many trials focused on negative symptoms and auditory verbal hallucinations, overlaid on the language network atlas that was prepared by Ev Fedorenko and group. So if you just overlay what are the language areas and what are the areas where we have safety data and feasibility data of giving TMS to patients with schizophrenia, what you see here in purple is the overlap between language areas and areas where TMS has already been safely given. and feasibility studied in negative symptoms and hallucinations, not in FTD. So I'm showing this only as a possibility of areas that we can use for perturb and measure studies. If you want to perturb language network and measure what happens to formal thought disorder, these could be possible sites that we can use. Also for clinical trials in persistent FTD, what happens when you perturb the language network over time? What happens to the burden of formal thought disorder? These questions can be studied when you use the language network framework, and the neural correlates are sought for formal thought disorder. Okay, well, that's probably brings me to the conclusion here. I just want to thank different sources of funding for generating the data that we have used so far. AMOSO is a regional funding body which supported our initial thought disorders study, longitudinal study. Also Western Brain Scan. We collect 7 Tesla scans in London, Ontario for a charge of $150 an hour. That's the cheapest you can get in the world, I think. And that's possible because of a large infrastructure grant we have. And also CHR, the Canadian Institute of Health Research, which has given a foundation grant for our program. And many other data sets that I've shown, have collected in the UK with the help of Wellcome Trust and the MRC. And also the current charities funding our work, the Bourgeois Foundation, as well as Graham Beck Foundation in Quebec, and the personal salary support from the Quebec government sustaining my activities today. Thank you very much for listening to this.
Thank you, Lena. That was very excellent, and thank you for the very thought-provoking summary of all the work that all of us need to continue to do, which is really good. Now I'll invite Philipp to give his discussion.
Thank you so much, Eric, and also thank you so much, Lena, for this really impressive and rich array of studies that you showed us. I thought what I might be doing now is highlighting a few concepts and revisiting some of the aspects that you either showed or alluded to, so that we get a more condensed idea of ways forward, really. And this was really helpful when we prepared this and discussed together the review that you mentioned. So many of the points I'm raising, you already raised in the review, I should say. So I think you will be very well prepared when we discuss this. And the 3 domains I thought I'd highlight are the construct and course of formal thought disorder. So I'd like to extend a little bit the question of neuroanatomy back to the construct of thought disorder. And then the neural correlates themselves. And I'd like to end with a more positive note and highlight the gains of understanding formal thought disorder. So what might be gained from a better understanding? So when we start with the construct and course of formal thought disorder, the first issue at hand is maybe the distinction between signs and symptoms, where we here have, as you well know, the opportunity to really have a sign at hand. In principle, this is one of the few signs in psychiatry, I would think, where an observer objectively can judge something. However, when we say that, we have judgment issues here, and Lena called this the bizarreness issue. So it's still not clear at what cutoff the discourse starts getting tangential or really incoherent. Lena, do you want to say something about this?
That's an excellent point that you bring up, Philipp. You know, the problems we have in measuring this construct. Just one thing to say is, whenever I try to judge somebody's peculiar word use, I'm actually judging myself how peculiar I am in understanding these word usages. So it's not a trivial issue using clinical rating scales, and I'm heartened to see Thilo and Peter Little in this audience, and I'm sure they will have some thoughts to add. To reflect on what you said, I think we have to solve this phenotype definition problem to a satisfactory conclusion. You know, we will not be able to have the most valid answer for this, but there has to be a consensus. What is the phenotype? How do we measure it? Without it, I think neural correlates, making sense of them, is really going to be a Herculean task.
Thank you. So then the next issue that we should address probably is the items and summaries issues of scales. As you know very well, we have very different scales that all have their own features and weaknesses. And sometimes we rely more on single items, but sometimes we rely on summaries of these items. So we have a scale issue at hand that also relates to the phenotyping that you just mentioned. Do you have any ideas of how we could proceed here?
I think we should open this discussion, but just one thought to add to this. I think there's no one good scale. All scales are good in some ways, and we can also choose all the scales to be used in a single study. And all I would say is, in addition to a clinical construct measure, I think we should all try to measure objective readouts of speech as well, and try to separate them when we present our results of what is the neural correlate of objective readouts and what is the neural correlate of a judged readout, which is the rating scale. We haven't been doing it methodically, and I think the time is just emerging now for us to take a deep interest into this, and hopefully moving forward studies will separate these two, seek similarities as well as dissimilarities in these two constructs.
Thank you. Next issue I'd like to highlight is related to the computational linguistics aspect that you also nicely summarized. And I think there's a theory issue at hand. We can also say it's a dimensionality issue, which predictor to choose. But I would like to highlight really the theory issue, because one thing that I noticed, or at least I think I'm noticing, is a bit of a agnostic and data-driven approach, which is fine in itself. But when you go back to some of the literature from the 80s, even the 70s, you notice that some of what has been known tends to be forgotten a few decades later. So I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on this, how we make sure that we use all the theoretic ideas at hand that have some richness in them to build the best models and test them against each other when we really want to capitalize on computational linguistics.
Well, I don't have a lot of thoughts on it. Maybe we should open this up and call well, Thilo, can I put you on spot and ask what your thoughts are on and not missing the history when we move forward with computational approaches?
Well, hi everybody. Hi Lena. Thanks very much for your great presentation and your fantastic studies, and also Philipp for your challenging questions. So am I the oldest here to comment on the history? Well, of course, there are lots of the old studies from the 80s that we should go back to and look at, particularly. Well, we have been doing this recently, or a year ago, looking at the trans-diagnostic features of clinically judged thought disorder and bipolar disorder and mania, and there are quite a lot of studies that from then prominent people, such as very excellent thought disorder people like Nancy Andreasen and others that are unfortunately not so much quoted anymore. So I would just say to Philipp and everybody, go back to these older papers and studies from the 80s. When the DSM-3 has been introduced, so there's a lot of stuff that we don't have to do again, and just look at this stuff. I'm wondering, Philipp, Homan, what you were thinking about it yourself, bringing this up.
Yeah, I brought this up mainly because I was a little worried that we might be reinventing the wheel sometimes, and then that particularly when we try these pioneering computational linguistic studies, that we tend to sometimes forget what has been known or what has been assumed with high evidence previously. And then we might find quite surprising effects in relatively small samples using hundreds of features, not considering a strong prior maybe that actually did not speak for this. For instance, more similarity instead of more incoherence could be something like this. So sometimes I wonder if a little more theory could put good priors into our studies. That's the only point I was trying to make here, and could help actually in feature selection. So the next issue I'd like to raise is the temporal stability issue. You've also alluded to it, Lena. Or in other words, can we distinguish between trait and state-like features in psychopathology of formal thought disorder? And do you think there is a very simplistic view maybe, but do you think there's the possibility to make this distinction well aligned to the distinction between the positive domain and the negative domain of thought disorder?
That's a great question, Philip. Now that I have an answer for it, but I just want to point everyone to a very nice synthesis done by Judith Ford and David Mathelin not long ago in Frontiers. The question raised was, why don't we find correlates for many symptoms? And Judith Ford summarized a lot of issues, and she also came up with this, highlighted this issue of trait versus state separation for many symptoms that we measure. And one possible solution she gave in that description was measure symptoms many times, not just one time. Measure them many times, and then average across those measurements. Now you will have variations across individuals that is around a mean averaged point, which is a trait level variation, rather than just a state variation. This is not going to solve all the problems, but it's an important approach, statistically sound approach for us to think about. I haven't, in all these imaging studies that we are discussing, we haven't done it at all. There's no study that has repeatedly measured FTD over time. And also the fact that we conflate the severity grading for thought disorder by two different dimensions. One is how frequent a phenomenon occurs. For example, during 1 hour of interview, if people have many slips, many incoherences, you will rate them higher. But we also sometimes rate a dysfunction that comes out of it. Not just single instant of incoherence may lead to the person stopping the entire conversation. That will also be graded. So there is a conflation between the frequency and dysfunction in our severity grading. And we also miss persistence as an important feature. We never ask the question how long a person has been suffering with this incoherence. And does that persistence relate better to structure and function? It may. We do not know because we don't really measure that using rating scales. I think parsing some of these issues may also help us to understand the trait versus state problems. Measuring many times will be helpful, not easy to do it clinically. Perhaps some of the digital health measures that we are advocating in different aspects of the group may help us. Experience sampling may help us with that, but not a trivial issue to discard, I guess.
Thank you. And the last point for the construct and course of thought disorder is a bit of a corollary, really, but it's something that just comes up for me again and again, and that's an inference issue, really. And it's the distinction between thought and speech. Are we really happy with the term of formal thought disorder when what we're talking really about is speech? You could say, okay, does it really matter? I mean, we just map whatever we measure to the neuroanatomy, but are we happy with the idea that we conflate these two, or we equate these two at this point?
I thought you're going to be friendly, Philip.
Trying to be.
We have Wolfram in the audience. I'm sure Wolfram has very nicely synthesized view of this problem. What is thought? What is language? But the issue you highlight when we seek neural correlates is a real one. The correlates of thought may be outside of the language network. The correlate of some of the phonetics and other things that we measure, the phonemic paraphasias, for example, maybe in the language network. If you just summarize all of them together, we may not be finding the correlates we want to. But this is probably the time for us to call Wolfram and see what he thinks. Wolfram?
Might not be hearing us. Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, hello everybody. Well, thanks Philip for raising this issue. I think that if we are measuring something that we are calling by a different name, then this invites us to think about their relationship. And if we are measuring language effectively, we need to look at properties of language that explain why it picks up an anomalous thought process. So there needs to be something about language that relates to the kind of thinking which is disturbed in schizophrenia. And I think that that connects to the other question you raised about a theory-driven approach. So what should it be about language that if it is disturbed, actually relates to a disc-grading thought process. And this is basically what I'm thinking about most of my time. What property of language could this be? And I think in my approach, this is reference. So there's two dimensions of meaning in language. One is lexical meaning and the other is referential meaning. And they have one important distinction. Lexical meaning doesn't depend on grammar, but referential meaning does. And a predominant clinical impression is that we don't know in form of sort of what people are talking about relates to the notion of reference. And I think reference is very difficult to capture with standard NLP tools. So I think here we really need to think about what would be a way of targeting this specific dimension of language. So I think that would give us the kind of strong priors, Philipp, that you were thinking about. But I'm not saying we are there yet, and we are kind of trying this in one or the other way in every study. This is where we are looking at noun phrases across different languages, because noun phrases relate to reference. So I think we need to go into language in its mechanics, in its workings, in order to understand why this connection between thought and speech or thought and language exists. I think it's an artificial distinction. These are just two terms, two names we are giving to an underlying phenomenon in nature that is just what it is, and you can't capture it as either being thought or being language.
Thank you, Wolfram. Also, thank you, Lena, for this. So the next domain I'd like to revisit with you is the neural correlates themselves. And the first point I'd like to highlight is the potential overemphasis on the dissemantic hypothesis, you could call it neuropsychologically. You know, there's the dissemantic hypothesis and the disexecutive hypothesis of thought disorder. And looking at the literature, one could get the impression, although Lena is clearly making a very good effort at counterbalancing this with his studies, you could get the impression that there's an overemphasis of assuming a dysfunctional language network in FTD. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little more about, Lena, about the language network specificity. And also, you alluded to it, the compensation issues that could be involved, that the language network itself is a dynamic thing. First of all, relatively difficult to find anatomically. It's not something where we could rely on anatomical landmarks so easily. We have to consider variations between subjects. We should probably use localizers, ideally, to demonstrate it. F. Fedorenko has recently shown that you can demonstrate it across, I think, a multitude of languages with these localizer approaches. But it's something we need to take into account even when we want to study it and when we want to say, is there evidence for the dissemantic hypothesis? We need to be careful about the variation in the language network.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So first of all, most of the studies synthesized in the meta-analysis that I've shown previously, they were based on tasks such as sentence completion, word generation, primarily linguistic tasks. So the way that the analysis happens with this is you generate a first level contrast. You find out what is the areas that everybody is activating when they're doing this task, and then you seek the group differences within this. So it is naturally biased towards finding differences of activity within the language system because of the nature of the tasks that are used. And the second problem is, if you really want to compare disexecutive versus dissemantic hypothesis for formal thought disorder, within the same experiment, there has to be competing, there has to be a refutation exercise. You have to do both tasks and see, which one really maps onto the symptoms. Very few studies have done it, almost none in those meta-analytical synthesis. Of course, it's not practically easy to do. But it's an important question, number two. Third is the issue of where is the language network? And I think everybody has different boundaries and distribution to some extent. This is what Fedorenko's localizer analysis has been telling us for a few years now. But very few studies have actually done an initial localizer scan for delineating a language network and then estimating connectivity within the system. I'm not talking about studies in resting fMRI or structural studies before seeking neural correlates. I think that's another thing to keep in mind for designing future studies. Running a localizer scan may help us to be more individual specific for pointing out language system problems. You also raise the issue of compensatory changes. And language system is somehow very notorious for this kind of reparations, if you think about it. It is an association cortex, and we know from aphasia studies, significant remapping of function happens after aphasia, after stroke, for example. And it's unthinkable that none of those kind of remappings may be happening in schizophrenia. There should be some compensatory mechanisms happening if this is really a language network problem from the beginning. But we haven't really focused on separating those issues yet. And again, like I said earlier, we need longitudinal studies. We need experimental paradigms as well, like provocation studies, such as the one that Thilo has done, giving ketamine before and after, for example. By the way, it's very hard to think about giving ketamine to patients these days. But we need to come up with other models of symptom provocation. I mean, one thing I find promising is a model that Iris, you're also working on, discontinuation of antipsychotics. So patients these days are often discontinuing antipsychotics with clinicians' input, with fully informed consent. So could we study before and after discontinuation? Because there are some symptoms that will at least transiently go up after discontinuation in certain patients. So this naturalistic experiments of discontinuation may be giving us an opportunity to long-term symptom provocation studies. But we still have to plan carefully for how we design our neural correlate studies in FTD. I think we haven't been doing that for a while now.
Thanks a lot. Then you really summarized this nicely, these different scales, the microscopic scale and the mesoscale and the manifest scale that we can observe, and the social scale. And you mentioned this very intriguing triple network salience model. Do you think it's possible, because it has been so prominent in our field, do you think it's possible to connect this type of model with a very dopaminergic focused idea that has been floating around for decades now and has recently been updated by Oliver House's group from more ventral to a more dorsal stream within the striatum?
Yeah, that's a great question, Philip. I think it's an important issue as well, because these models are not completely independent in many ways. The dopaminergic midbrain model, as well as the salience network-centered model. As we speak, we're working on a synthesis, myself and Vinod Menon, trying to bring these two things together, because midbrain aberrant salience model and the insular-based model is actually bound nicely by the framework of prediction error and prediction error issues. Of course, dopamine is a natural companion to the prediction error ideas that we discuss often from reinforcement learning paradigms. But what you see is, if you look at cortical activation during prediction error processing, anterior insula is a very prominent hub node that emerges during prediction error processing. Phil Corlett has recently put out a very nice meta-analysis in the neuropsychopharmacology, I think. This was also replicated independently by Cardo's group in Italy, Franco Cardo's group. Two different meta-analyses synthesizing prediction error in healthy people, both showing anterior insula as well as striatum, dorsal striatum, and ventral striatum playing a very important role in processing PE information. So I think there's a construct level connection between midbrain salience model and the cortical salience models. In schizophrenia, this could be more domain general. This is not probably a system that only maps onto disorganization. It could map onto other things as well. The point I made today is this system could play a role in formal thought disorder. It's not probably playing a role only in formal thought disorder.
Thanks very much. And the final question here, since you mentioned the prediction error framework, and it also naturally comes up when you think of the active inference framework that you mentioned in Roberto's beautiful work, could you maybe walk us through this, because this is a really complex, maybe it is not that complex, but it is not so easy to understand, at least to me. So the idea would here be that the brain generates models to predict the causes of the things that it perceives, right? And the prediction error between what is predicted and what is perceived can further be reduced through intervening with the world, through acting, right? This is the active inference idea as far as I understand it, and very, very broadly summarize it, of course. There's much more to it. But you're saying through language, through communication, this prediction error can also be minimized by interrogating the environment, or this is something I didn't fully.
Yeah, so I mean, again, I'm going to call Peter Little later on to add on to this discussion, because Peter has put out a very nice review of a coding framework in schizophrenia. Just to answer the point on active inference and language, this is not simply based on prediction error, but in a more broader rubric of uncertainty reduction. So, you know, we are uncertain about the things around us, the world. We have to be certain, and we have to reduce this level of uncertainty. This is a general principle behind the free energy discussions that Carl Friston often invokes. So one of the uncertainty is about what the other person is thinking, what they're going to say, for example, in social situations. How do we reduce this uncertainty? By asking questions, by, you know, verbal and non-verbal behavior, you know, chat with people, to chat with them, to really establish a connection and reduce this uncertainty. And this happens in formal and informal situations as well, using language to reduce uncertainty. So in this framework, you speak because you have some uncertainties about the world around you, and you use speech as a tool to reduce this. So speech is in this active inference framework, not a tool for communication simply, not to tell what you think, but to understand what other people are thinking. But Peter can add more on, you know, what prediction error itself is doing in schizophrenia and why it's central. Peter, can you help?
Well, that's, like all of Philipp's questions, a good challenge. I guess, well, the first thing I'd say, I mean, I first got involved in notions of prediction error way back with Chris Frith and Carl Friston when we were together at the Hammersmith many years ago, when we largely were exploring the difference between self-generated speech versus externally presented speech, and we were really interested in what happened in the superior temporal gyrus, where effectively we got evidence. This was using PET, positron emission tomography with oxygen 15 years ago, that you know, clearly when you generate speech, you send a signal to your superior temporal gyrus that effectively makes you prepared to receive the auditory input, and you therefore react to it less when you generate it yourself. Okay, that was where this stuff got going 3 decades ago now, I suppose, but since then, there's been a lot of, well, I guess a lot of ideas and some experimental stuff on the fact that this effectively prediction errors are tested at multiple hierarchical levels in the brain or in the mind. So it's not just you know, the discrepancy between the sensory input perceived in the well, not perceived, since sensory input to the primary sensory area versus what, you know, what the internal well, the corollary discharge, the internally generated signal, has told you to expect. So so I guess first thing to say, and I'm not sure that it really, well, okay, there's no real answer to all this, but I think one's got to be aware that in the normal human brain, you know, this balancing between what your internal generation of what to expect with what comes in through the sensory system will be effectively, the incoming signals will be cascaded up. Okay, and I think when we get to what's going on in schizophrenia, I think that probably some of the stuff that's relevant to the disorganization of language, and I would also say disorganization of other aspects of mental processing, affect, and the organization of behavior, that these things occur at a higher level. So so for what it's worth, now the question, where does dopamine come into this, because I think that's maybe where Philipp's question was starting. I think that if there are prediction errors, then, you know, the dopamine, well, effectively midbrain dopamine is released. So somehow there's clearly are multiple projections down to the midbrain. So so if I'm saying anything here, I'm really saying that in trying to tease out what's going on, it's not just the the comparison of the sensory signal in the superior temporal gyrus with the corollary discharge from the frontal lobes or wherever they're generated, but it's occurring at multiple hierarchical levels. But these different levels at which the prediction error occurs, I think all of them almost certainly in either directly or indirectly elicit dopaminergic signals indicative of the degree of prediction error. So don't know whether that really helps. It just says everything is more complicated the more you think about it.
Yes, certainly.
Thanks,
well,
Peter.
thanks so much.
If you don't mind, can I call Roberto Limongi? He's the brain behind this active inference hypothesis that we're working on. Roberto could add a little bit more on the active inference.
Well, thank you very much, Lena. And thank you very much for the nice presentation. I mean, I have a couple of points to remark here, especially regarding Philipp's comment. First of all, I mean, active inference in general is a theory driven. So active inference is a theory about the organism, how the organism as a whole behaves in the environment. And the way the organism is supposed to behave is normative. It's by minimizing free energy. It's a quantitative measure or index of stability between the organism and the environment. And the free energy concept split in two, the variational and the expected. The variational is what formerly was called predictive coding. I mean, predictive coding is a special case of active inference, but not the other way around. Active inference is more general. So variational free energy speaks to predictive coding because it is intuitive to understand. If I have a prior belief about the environment and there is an objective reality, the discrepancy between both is a prediction error. So it is very intuitive to understand that, but that comes only to the variational free energy part of active inference. The other is expected free energy. The expected free energy is the free energy minimization that the organism, for example, myself, would achieve if I behave in some way, if I performed any action in the environment. Language in this context can be regarded as a special case of action. The same way Skinner referred to language as a verbal behavior. Now, in more general sense, language as an action is a way to minimize free energy. And we have two different ways to minimize free energy. One is through communication, and the other is through understanding of the environment, the ideational perspective that Halliday pointed a time ago in his view of function of language. So in this case, the referential point of language in terms of making sense of the world is a way to minimize the expected free energy. If I spoke about the world in this way, how much of this free energy I would minimize in terms of minimizing the uncertainty. That is the role that a language would play in this context. And as a global theory of the function of the organism in the environment, this generalizes to the uncertainty concept. And the uncertainty concept not only refers to language, but also to the general uncertainty that the organism has about its interaction with the environment. So this is how language becomes a part of the whole system called active inference.
Thank you very much, Roberto.
Thank you all, I think. Obviously, we've got the very robust discussion going on, but I'll open it up to everybody else now. I see Sunny has a question, which I'll read out. I think Sunny's just joined the call again. Lena, so interesting results on aberrant switching between the default mode network and central executive. You've written on the predictive coding hypothesis of speech disturbances in the past. And do you think these brain network findings can be understood in a predictive coding framework?
Yeah, I think, we were discussing this topic just a few minutes ago. Yeah, I think we don't have a good generative model of language yet. And because of that, we don't have a generative model of formal thought disorder yet. But there are attempts being made, and Roboto's work is one example. Gina and Brown, Cooperberg and Brown have put in another example of a generative model of linguistic comprehension. And Venkat and I wrote about social discourse and how uncertainty reduction there could be a model as well. But it's not computationally framed. I think the role that these networks play is likely to be in various different models. I think you have models, you have brain networks. The networks are there, whatever models you use. So I think they will lean on what parameters that these models predict will be related to the triple network system dysfunction is yet to be investigated. In our own model that Roboto is working on, the within network connectivity in the salience network seems to relate to this hidden Markovian prediction, Markovian estimation of conceptual disorganization based on analytical thinking score, based on group information, as well as symptom measurements that we have. So to answer your question, yes, there is a predictive coding and broader active inference frameworks that will help us to understand this. And I think this triple network system, being information processing system at the end of the day, will have a role and map onto many parameters.
So just to follow up on that a bit, would you go at this point, would you go so far as to say that the triple network model and the switching between them is actually reflective of the processes outlined by an active inference model? Or is it too early to draw such a direct link?
If you, in a very simplistic fashion, again, I'm going to jump a lot of conceptual issues, but in a very simplistic fashion, if we assume that some of our goal representations are autobiographical, internal, and they operate in a DMN mode, for example, and then our active action that we do in the environment is based on the frontoparietal executive system. The switching between these two, being the one that's facilitated by salience network, should be really relying on solving some of the uncertainties and working us towards the goal. So I think the framework of prediction error and active inference is something that will fit very nicely with this internal to external switching model. Is there any direct evidence for that? Apart from some of the scratching the surface attempts that some of us are making, I don't think there's a very convincing data that we can say that this is how it operates. But I think circumstantial evidence is compelling.
Right. I think Venkat, you had a question as well. If anybody wants to ask a question, also just raise your hand and we'll get to you. Oh. Venkat?
Yeah. Thanks, Lena. The question I had was the active inference work that you put forth. It's quite fascinating. So I was just curious to know whether hallucinations were measured in those subjects, especially because the insula and the anterior cingulate is quite closely linked with hallucinations, as well as the works that you have summarized in terms of the overlapping networks between the FTD and hallucination. So it seems quite compelling. So I was curious to know whether.
Yeah. So that's a great question, Venkat. So the Roboto's work that I showed was driven by this theory that we can model disorganization, conceptual disorganization based on linguistic readouts. So we haven't fitted the same model with every individual symptom score. It's another different kind of model testing space. We haven't undertaken that. But one thing I can say is in the kind of samples that we study, acutely psychotic patients who are having acute disorganization, not treated or treated for less than 2 days in most cases, you do see the symptom variance is higher. And you have more ability to capture and model variations in symptoms in the sample compared to a persistent chronic sample group where things are subdued for a while after treatment. But this is something we can look at into the data, how much hallucination scores load onto our model. And as we speak, I can see Roboto taking notes, and we're going to do this.
Thank you.
All right, I see a couple of hands up, so I think we'll go with Emily, then Thilo, then Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Lena, for the talk. It was like really thought-provoking. Like I really appreciate it. You raised at some point the point of like how severe FDT has to be, like in order to rate something, or like, and I wanted to know a little bit more about in the different studies that you presented, like how like severe, like, and I guess just to give a little bit more background, like I've been targeting in my studies mostly people who wouldn't necessarily rate as FDT according, at least if we take the PANS P2 item, but like who still present some levels of like language like abnormalities. So like I guess I'm sort of asking, like, were your studies targeting more like inpatients or less stabilized patient, or like would you personally rate more stabilized patient with relatively low level of FTD, or like so big? Yeah. Anyways, I just wanted to hear more about that in general.
Thanks, Emily. That's an important problem, important point. Where do we set our own thresholds of defining presence of FTD? For the studies that I've shown, I have to say I had a good fortune of working with Peter Ladel for a long time and still continue to work with Peter. And one of the instruments that Peter has provided is TLI, the Thought Language Index. It works very similar to, the other speech-based metrics that are available. The reason we use that is it's very sensitive for even normal healthy controls variations in speech, because you have items that are not always dependent on judging somebody's clinical status. They're primarily dependent on how they produce words, how they produce sentences. So you can objectively, to some extent, without knowing the diagnosis of the patient, you could rate it, which is somewhat unlike using P2 scores in PANS, where you sit with the patient and ask 30 different questions. You spend 45 to 50 minutes. You cannot disentangle yourself from the impression that you make about the overall severity of the patient's conditions as well. So that has helped us to be sensitive. But most studies, what we've done is we use TLI scores in a continuum with positive and negative FTD as two different dimensions and related them to neural correlates. The Roboto's work that I showed, the P2, again used as a continuous score in this context, not as a threshold finding exercise. That's also because of the nature of the samples, and I alluded to previously. We have more variance in our scores of form of thought disorder. I think if you go to a very institutionalized setting, for example, chronic patients, you may not find that degree of variation. You may find some people with very severe thought disorder, but many people will have too subtle or something that you cannot record easily with rating scales.
I think it's a very important question, like when it comes to like functioning of the patients, like because like really like for me at least, like a very important aspect is like how do these language difficulties impact like functioning in everyday life, like, and how can we go about it? So if we're only targeting people who would rate as FTD, who are probably unstable patient with more need to be stabilized rather than a need to be helped with their functioning once they're stabilized, like, and so I think it's very important, those more subtle like difficulties that like if they have an impact on your understanding when you're rating them, necessarily has an impact on the understanding of people they're interacting with in their everyday life as well. So
yeah, that's true. Thanks, Emily.
I might go to Thilo.
Yes, thanks. Thanks again for this great discussion. I just want to make a few comments. That the first is that a positive form of thought disorder has several factors. So if we speak about form of thought disorder, we should always specify, and Lena has been doing this and talking about conceptual disorganization. I think this is the level of precision we should apply. This relates to the second comment I want to make about the language network you have been alluding to, that is usually Broca's and Wernicke's area. So what we have been and others have been doing is, if you if you look at conceptual disorganization and control for other psychopathological factors, such as hallucinations, for example, or other form of thought disorder factors, what you find is not Broca's and Wernicke's area, but other brain areas, what you have called, well, what is being called the extended language network. And Lena, you've been alluding to that particularly in the right hemisphere, the temporal lobe and the lateral prefrontal cortex. So when you control for other symptoms, usually what shows up is right hemispheric areas. So we should not, I think, focus entirely on Broca's and Wernicke's area that are of course important, but there is a lot of confounding issues there. You have been showing this fantastic meta-analysis on hallucinations. It's just one issue. So when we control for other factors, for example, in a DTI study, we find positive form of thought disorder being correlated in the DTI study with the right cingulum bundle, which is of course a bit surprising, but this is the data. And the last thing I want to just mention is that an issue that has been raised, what is thought, what is language. There is also the factors of a subjective form of thought disorder that patients perceive only by themselves, and that are not being so much being mirrored in language, and we can also have a look at that. Of course, that's very difficult and what you make out of that, but I just want to point that out. So thanks again, Lena, for your great talk.
Thank you, Thilo. This is important points. Yes, I haven't focused much on the subjectivity, and I think your TALD scale is probably the only scale that gives you some measure of subjective thought disorder phenomena. Thanks a lot for pointing it out. Great. Peter.
Yeah, it's your turn, Peter, and I think you're on mute.
I've unmuted, I hope. Right. Yes. Once again, thanks, Lena, for just simply so many thought-provoking ideas as always. Now you've raised issues of brain areas beyond the language network and overlap with other symptoms, with emphasis on hallucinations. And Amelia has asked the question about relationship with function in daily life. And I guess one thing that I personally have thought is important for 30 years or more now, and I think it touches on those three issues, and that is, is there a part of disorganization of language which is part of a more general disorganization of selection of mental activity across different modalities of mental activity, and what we found in some of the early PET work we did back in the 80s and 90s was that we found the correlates of disorganization summed across language and behavior and affect. The correlates were most strongly with the anterior cingulate and the insula. Now, I scarcely knew what the insula was when I found it, and it was a long time before Seeley or anybody else identified the salience network. So by accident, we found the salience network in, 30 years ago. And that at that time, I related, I suppose, to the concept of selective attention, which we thought back in the 80s was very much an anterior cingulate function. If there was a bit of the brain that was specifically involved in selecting what you attended to, it was the anterior cingulate. So I suppose, it's a comment and maybe a question for anybody to comment on is to what extent, should we be understanding the disorganization of language in the context of disorganization of selection of activities, selection of activity across multiple modalities, and that clearly has implications both for brain networks extended beyond the language network, but also I think points us at least in the empirical data from many years ago towards the salience network, which, as Lena has emphasized, is the involved in the switching in the triple network story. So anyway, I'll be interested in anybody's comments on that. Or maybe Lena, you should start off if you've got something to comment.
Yeah, that's a great observation, Peter, and good reminder that before networks are defined, people were finding these networks using PET and other modalities, mapping on with what we are now understanding as dysfunctions. The one comment I would just add on to what you said is disorganization in the domain of motor activities, motor disorganization.
Yes.
Sebastian Walter was here, he just left, I think. He would have had something more to add. Catatonic disorganization, motor disorganization may map very, very much onto some of these domains. And I guess if we can think of this as not as a unitary construct, but disorganization happening in many faculties, and perhaps there is a thread that connects these levels of disorganization, and that thread could be traced back to certain neural systems like salience network, for example. But still, for each of these domains to be disorganized and dysfunctional, there may be additional elements that are required, and language network may have to be also disintegrated to some extent in its function for a dysfunctional salience network to produce formal thought disorder. And that kind of rubric helps me to make peace with all the different findings that we have in schizophrenia. I'm sure many other ideas around this may exist. And Iris is in the group, and she did lots of work on right and left hemisphere differences and domain-specific issues like hallucinations. Maybe Iris can add some more to this discussion as well.
I think Iris dropped out already.
Oh, she just dropped out. Okay, yeah. But anyone else as well, who can add to this would be interesting. Sunny?
Sorry, I'm not sure I followed the discussion fully.
The domains of disorganization, language is not just the only disorganized faculty. There's a lot of other disorganization happens. And what we see as neural correlates, are they representing a general disorganization that underlies schizophrenia? I think there's a good case to make from some of the studies I showed. Schizophrenia as a diagnostic construct relates to this connectivity. You don't really have to have severe degree of thought disorder for some of them to emerge.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that perspective. So one classic finding, so I think Philipp referred to these understandings that we've had from decades past that we then forget and then remember and come back and forth. To me, one of those is the motor disorganization that we also see. I believe that was among the earliest observations of schizophrenia, even dating back to Kraepelin, and it comes back every once in a while. But at the moment, I think there's not a lot of work relating, I think, the idea of language speech disorganization to the general, even movement related this type of disorganization that is also very prevalent in schizophrenia. And then zooming out from there, I've had in my own kind of musings, I've often, even going beyond further, I've often thought about how disconnectivity and disorganization can be thought of as a common thread that links not only the biological understanding of psychosis, but in some ways the cognitive behavioral understanding and even the more psychoanalytic, psychodynamic understandings as well. When I was a resident, one of my supervisors tried to tell me that schizophrenia was a problem with expressed emotion. I said, no, that's not right. And so he asked me, like, well, what is schizophrenia then? And I was kind of taken aback and at a loss for an explanation for a while. But I think more and more so, it really is, as Lena, as you beautifully outlined, it's a problem to me of disconnectivity on all of these levels of analysis.
Thanks, Sunny. I think we've got a question from Turjay. I hope I've pronounced that correctly in the chat. Would you like to ask a question?
Hi, Professor. It's really loud places. That is why I type it. Maybe you can help.
Oh, okay. I'll read it out then. All right. So thank you for the great presentation. I have a question. We have common and extended core language networks. However, thanks to, for instance, connectome analysis, we have started to find quite different networks and hubs when we compare different languages from different language families. For example, Arabic versus German versus Chinese or Turkish in healthy people. So can we find different language-specific phenotypes or even endophenotypes to detect psychosis in the early stages, except from the universal ones? And how do researchers take care of these linguistic differences in their studies?
Wow, that's an important question and really a huge problem. And I think some of our activities within Discourse is really focused on solving this kind of cross-linguistic differences, which we expect, but we do not know whether they exist yet. We haven't estimated how much they exist within the study of psychosis. But one thing I want to point out is the paper that Philipp just mentioned, Eva Fedorenko's localizer work. She managed to bring 45 different languages, people from different parts of the world. They all flew to East Coast to get scanned, and all of them went through this localizer procedure. So she uses a very simple localizer, which is sentence minus non-words, and she extracted the network that stands for language in this kind of localizer procedures, and they're surprisingly similar, very overlapping. There are some differences, but there's more commonalities than differences in what we call as language areas across different languages. For example, some of the more figurative languages have more prefrontal contribution in the language network, but others do not. More phonetic languages are primarily temporally represented in this network, but there's no, they're not fully different. You're not having a representation that is unexpected for any of these languages. So I think that is positive news when we seek these differences. But in psychosis, how this plays out is a big question. We just do not know how the dysfunction across different languages, are they correlated, are they similar spatially or not? It's a big question. And the only, well, we've started seeing some results in this kind of cross-linguistic, computational linguistic work. Like Alberto Perallo is doing some very interesting work here, and Wolfram Hinzen with his collaborations in Turkey and other places, also producing some cross-linguistic work. But in the imaging field, probably not, we're not there yet. I think it'll take some time and effort to get there.
Thank you so much.
Do we have any other questions relating to this? Well, everyone has the thing. Lena, I wanted to ask, you talked about, one day we'll get to that point where we can analyze two people talking to each other. Yeah. And then we can be, what is the term people like to use these days? Ecologically valid, right? Yeah. And I think it feeds a lot into the discussions we've had quite a long time about, what is the best way to elicit speech and, all these scenarios. And I think you listed quite nicely, some of the main challenges. And I'm thinking back to, psycholinguistic work. We know that, language production and language comprehension is in this loop. We know that, how do people factor in the feedback mechanisms? Do you think there might be something very speech and language specific, or would we just tap into the more general, self-monitoring feedback mechanisms?
Yeah, this is the idea that we can do hyperscanning, two people together and scan them and understand. It's very appealing, but there's lots of problems and hurdles to overcome before we get there in terms of analysis, data collection, and also having a good theory to model the data that we collect. It's not going to be a trivial task. To discuss if this is specific to language, I think, I'm just going back to what Wolfram said about the way that we can think differently about language. Other faculties such as theory of mind, social cognition, these can be thought of as a special case of language in some sense. Theory of mind itself, if you think of one of the functions of language is this reduction of uncertainty. Speech is to reduce uncertainty, to understand what happened, what's going on around you, what the other person is thinking. Then automatically the whole concept of theory of mind becomes a component of how speech is implied. And other nonverbal behaviors are employed as well, speech and gestures, I have to say, not just speech. So I think, two-person scanning, hyperscanning, EEG, FNIRS will give us some leads about how we can separate speech-related signals with some of these nonverbal behaviors that happen in a two-person setting. I have a PhD student, Emmanuel, who's going to start very soon on simple imitative behaviors, motor behaviors between two people, and also starting to do some hyperscanning EEG with this kind of paradigm. So maybe we'll have some answers in 2 years, 2.5 years time from now.
Yeah, I think Sani just said that there's some work in autism looking at, conversation partners and all that. So I'm all for borrowing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sani, for those pointers.
Thanks, Sani. Peter, got another point?
Yes, well, again, a couple of comments on, the things that we've just been discussing. First of all, this question of the most sensitive way to elicit formal thought disorder. Lena has talked about both the exciting but I think complicated possibility of the hyperscanning. Now, something that I was involved working with Thilo on when he was in London back in the 1990s, was using Rorschach ink blots, which I think we found that, in other words, ambiguous stimuli such as Rorschach ink blots were actually pretty potent at eliciting formal thought disorder, even in people who you didn't have the sort of very overt formal thought disorder of the type you might see in acute psychosis. So I would just sort of, I suppose, point out that ambiguous stimuli bring in their own complexities, but allow you to tease apart, if you like, the social situation from the stimulus. But the other point I want to make here, I mean, that's really just a comment about a bit from history. But the other thing is this issue of different cultures and different languages that that we were just discussing, that Tujse brought up, is when it comes to scoring subtle thought disorder, there are huge problems if the person doing the scorer is of different cultural background, let alone a different native language background. Lena's very well spoken positively about the sensitivity of the TLI. The TLI was designed to be sensitive and give you a measure across very subtle levels. But I find that I've been very, if you like, disappointed the more I've worked in multicultural societies in trying to score it. So it's actually not the point about are the different languages different in the language system, but rather how you score subtle peculiarity or oddness in word choice or sentence structure when you've got people from different cultural or different native language backgrounds. So that just is another confound of how you score thought disorders, and it's, to me, it's really weakened my optimism about the TLI when I first designed it working in a very monocultural society, and the more I've got into multicultural societies, the more difficult I found it.
That's a very interesting point, Peter. I just want to say that made me recall some of the very intense sessions that we've had trying to score transcripts with the TLI thing. I speak a language, Tamil, one of the oldest languages, but it doesn't have articles. So no A, no and, no the. Yes. I have always had problems in understanding somebody's peculiar sentence.
Exactly. Well, I must say, Lena, you, compared to many of the other people who've come from a different language background that I've worked with, you actually did better at comprehending native English speakers than a lot of people did. And I guess it just reflects the fact that you've been sensitive to what you've heard over all those years. Anyway, enough about that. The fact is, this cross-cultural and cross-language thing is not only raises questions about whether, if you like, the neural systems are different, but just even how we score it. And that's a challenge.
Yeah.
And in my experience, not just how we score it, but also how we transcribe it. So some of our data is transcribed locally and some is transcribed in Toronto. And the folks in Toronto have a much harder time transcribing our patients than we do.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of summarizing that adage of how you speak is how I hear it. And I think it segues quite well to your point earlier, Lena, and I think this is probably, the last question we have time for today. Not the question so much, but you were talking about, we need to do the mapping against objective speech. We need to do the mapping against, a century's worth of formal thought disorder work, and to disregard one for the other is not right in any way. And I think that's pretty much what the summary of this.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Eric, for that summary. And thanks also, Philip, for all the discussion and everyone for participating in this.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. We'll see you last Friday of August for the next session of Discourse. See you next time. Recording will be up on YouTube.